It's been said that wars have the ability to speed up the process of history. We only have to look at the two world wars of the 20th century to find the necessary evidence to prove that this is indeed the case. The First World War, fought between 1914 and 18, was described as the war to end all wars, but as the process of history attests, sadly was not the case. Consequently, when the issues of reparation and redistribution of land came to a head within 20 years of an armistice being signed, matters accelerated at an alarming speed after the formal declaration of war against Adolf Hitler's Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. The Second World War is without doubt a huge topic to cover, and in this programme, thanks to a remarkable collection of archive images, you can see for yourself the great defining moments of this conflict and the legacy left to future generations of lessons to be learned if history is not to be repeated. Statistically speaking, the Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history, having claimed the lives of more than 70 million people, the vast majority of whom were civilians. It was also the most costly war of all time in monetary terms as well, at an estimated $1 trillion. And it's only been in more recent years that many of the debts incurred, most notably that of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's generous lend-lease to Great Britain, have been paid back in full. Needless to say, picking out the defining moments from undoubtedly one of history's most important and complex events is far from being an easy task, especially in a limited amount of time. However, as in all things, starting way back at the beginning will be the most logical course of action. By 1938, it was evident that Adolf Hitler was prepared to go to any lengths, not only to put Germany back on the European map as a force to be reckoned with, but also to build a German empire that would even rival the Romans from so many centuries earlier. Hitler had already marched his army into the Rhineland, forced Austria into unification, and set his sights on the Czech Sudetenland. For the people of Britain, the threat of all-out war with Germany was so real, even gas masks were issued while children were evacuated from London. But the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was determined to negotiate a peaceful settlement with Adolf Hitler. In fact, one of the most iconic images of the 1930s is that of Chamberlain returning from meeting the German dictator in Munich, along with Italy's Benito Mussolini and the French Premier Edouard Daladier. The elder statesman waved a piece of paper signed by Hitler, agreeing that if he was unhindered in his bid for the Sudetenland, this would be his last territorial advance in Europe. Chamberlain was given a rapturous reception upon his return, telling the British people that this meant peace for our time. And as the evacuees came safely home, the first defining moment of the Second World War delivered a promise that it might never even begin. However, with all the wisdom that hindsight gives mere mortals, we of course know that Adolf Hitler was not to be trusted. But back in 1938, this was far from common knowledge. What had been happening in Nazi Germany, including the persecution of many Jews, the killing of the mentally ill, and the vicious murders of political opponents, was still little known by the outside world. Yet there's every justification for this being a defining moment, because it gave Adolf Hitler time to build his military strength. And when he marched his troops into the Czechoslovakian capital, Prague, in March 1939, neither Britain nor France was in any position to do anything about it. Precious time had been lost, and Adolf Hitler had every advantage, something that would characterize the first few years of the conflict. As the Nazis moved through Europe, becoming even bolder, it was evident that the British Prime Minister was unlikely to stand up against Hitler. This may seem of little significance today, but before World War II, the British Empire made the island nation a force to be reckoned with, on an equal footing with the Americans and the Russians. By the late summer of 1939, Hitler was preparing to extend his stranglehold on Europe with an invasion of Poland, but was all too aware that Joseph Stalin and the Russians on the eastern side would not be as easy to deal with as Chamberlain had been back in 1938. Hitler needed to be certain Stalin would not attack the Germans, and therefore agreed a non-aggression pact with Russia before ordering his tanks into Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Neville Chamberlain now had to face another defining moment, as along with the French, the British were equally bound by a diplomatic pact to come to Poland's aid. The British Prime Minister gave Hitler an ultimatum: withdraw from Poland by 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September, or a state of war would exist between the United Kingdom and Germany. And there being no such undertaking from Hitler, Chamberlain announced the news to the people of Britain in a radio broadcast on that fateful Sunday morning.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Despite the obvious disadvantage the British military were at because of Chamberlain's failure to go on the attack, little action was taken over the next few months, and this period of time, distinctly lacking in defining moments, became known as the Phony War. Nevertheless, there was nothing phony about Adolf Hitler's strategic advances, but there was one voice loudly making itself heard in British politics, urging Chamberlain to take the fight to the Germans. With the declaration of war on the 3rd of September came the news that the lone voice, Winston Churchill, had been called to serve at the Admiralty as the First Lord. Throughout the 1930s, Winston Churchill had warned the world of the threat that Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany posed. But Churchill was dismissed as a political has-been who was well past his sell-by date. When his wise words of warning proved to be so well-founded, this view changed dramatically, and as the people of Great Britain looked for a hero, the Admiralty signalled its ships with just 3 words: "Winston is back." As the Phony War progressed, Churchill again came to the fore, predicting that Hitler would invade the countries of Scandinavia to protect his supply route of raw materials from Norway. Churchill implored Chamberlain to send troops to prevent this from happening, but again the British Prime Minister favoured a wait-and-see approach, and once more it was only when it was too late, as Hitler's troops stormed through Denmark and Norway, that Chamberlain realised his error of judgment. The crowds who had cheered Chamberlain the peacemaker on his return from Munich no longer had any confidence in their Prime Minister, and on the 10th of May 1940 he was replaced by none other than Winston Churchill as head of a wartime coalition government. For Churchill, as he offered nothing but blood, toil, tears and sweat, one of the most crucial defining moments of the entire conflict faced him within hours of taking up residence at number 10 Downing Street, as Hitler's blitzkrieg advance through the Low Countries began. With the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, already fighting on mainland Europe, Churchill had an added incentive for implementing a rescue mission as the Nazi war machine thundered into France from the east and the south, capturing the Allied troops in a seemingly inescapable pincer movement. It was a time for heroism, and Churchill rose to the challenge, inspiring Britain's civilians to follow his lead. As the Allied forces retreated to the beaches of Dunkirk, facing certain death at the hands of the Germans, the British Navy, augmented by any seaworthy craft that could be mustered to cross the Channel, set out on a daring rescue mission that the elegant Churchill described as a miracle of deliverance. The flotilla of 700 little ships, which included everything from luxury yachts to tugboats and paddle steamers, set sail for France, not knowing what carnage they'd find there. Owners were supplied with nothing more than a tin hat and a warning that they were embarking on a very dangerous mission, and when they reached the French coast, they worked tirelessly to ferry home the waiting soldiers. Some made many journeys, and with the British Navy having estimated being able to rescue about 45,000 men, when the numbers were finally counted, in the early days of June 1940, more than 330,000 Allied servicemen had survived to fight another day. Winston Churchill had had his miracle, which was especially poignant as Hitler had said to his officers before starting this offensive to take the Low Countries and France, "Gentlemen, you are about to witness the most famous victory in history." For the first time, Adolf Hitler's carefully planned military strategy had failed to deliver the success the Führer had become so accustomed to. It could be said that although overall the Germans had won the battle for Dunkirk, the Allies had been triumphant even in defeat. Winston Churchill was now offering inspired leadership, while the people of Great Britain all shared the invincible spirit of Dunkirk, and Hitler now had more of a fight on his hands for the island nation than he could ever have imagined. When you consider what happened at Dunkirk, there are a number of factors that are intriguing, and as defining moments go, the end of May and the beginning of June 1940 are some of the most fascinating of the entire war. Firstly, Hitler, having brilliantly manoeuvred the Allied troops onto the beaches of Dunkirk, ordered his panzer tank divisions to halt just a matter of miles short of the stranded Allies. It's fair to say, with a rescue mission of the scale launched by Churchill highly unlikely, that Hitler could have assumed he would have all the time in the world to allow his Air Force, the Luftwaffe, the honour of finishing the operation. However, it has also been suggested that Hitler permitted the Allies to escape as a goodwill gesture, because he was still hoping for a negotiated peace with the British. But if this was indeed the case, he had seriously misjudged the mood of his enemy. Winston Churchill openly declared in one of his finest speeches, "We shall never surrender." And Hitler quickly realised if he was going to invade Britain, he would have a huge battle ahead of him that, despite his position of strength, would result in Adolf Hitler's first defeat of the conflict. From a strategic point of view, Hitler was well aware that the German navy was inferior to that of the British, while the Luftwaffe, on paper at least, was significantly stronger than the RAF. Consequently, the Battle of Britain began on the 10th of July 1940, as Hitler aimed to destroy the British Air Force and their bases, so that when his invasion force attacked, there'd be no hindrance from the skies. But Hitler had failed to account for the spirit of Dunkirk, and the British were victorious in the skies. Holding off the Luftwaffe until the autumn meant that a German invasion would not be possible due to weather and the tides. Undeterred, Hitler redirected his pilots to bomb London and Britain's major cities, instigating a terror campaign that has gone down in history as the Blitz. Again, the Dunkirk spirit came to the fore as communities rallied to support each other, and although the British stood alone in the struggle against Adolf Hitler, as 1941 dawned, the conflict was escalating on a global scale, and assistance from the United Kingdom's natural allies, the USA, was soon forthcoming. From the outbreak of World War II, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been keen to support the Allies' fight against Adolf Hitler, but due to isolationist public opinion, America had remained neutral. However, when after losing so many vehicles and vast quantities of ordnance on the road to Dunkirk, Winston Churchill begged Roosevelt to "give us the tools and we will finish the job." The American president did all that he could short of declaring war on Germany, passing a Lend-Lease Act in March 1941 that would provide the funding to enable Britain some chance of withstanding Hitler's onslaught. This, combined with a rather unexpected change of tactics from Adolf Hitler, meant that matters looked considerably brighter for Winston Churchill and the British, although it would open up one of the darkest chapters in the war, especially for the citizens of Russia. Having failed to achieve the objectives of Operation Sea Lion, the code name for the invasion of Great Britain, on the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler set Operation Barbarossa in motion, as 3 million German troops marched into Russia, opening up an eastern front. His aim was to conquer the Soviet Union before winter, but Stalin's Red Army had very different ideas. The fight would be long and bitter, and Hitler's decision to renege on his non-aggression pact with Stalin would cost him dear. What's more, the alliances of the conflict to date changed overnight, and Winston Churchill immediately contacted Stalin to secure the might of Russia to fight for the Allied cause. For the American president, this was an equally dramatic turn of events, but Roosevelt had another more pressing issue demanding his attention out in the Pacific, as the USA was about to experience one of the most defining moments of their entire history. The conflict between America and Japan had been growing in the Pacific since the beginning of the war, and Roosevelt put sanctions in place by July 1941, designed to curtail the imperial Japanese nation and their expansionist dreams in the Far East. And this is where the link with the war in Europe became so much more clearly defined, as the Japanese had signed a tripartite pact with the Germans and the Italians back in 1940 that formalised the Axis powers. Undoubtedly, the last thing Hitler wanted, as he continued to bombard Britain and take on the mighty Russians, was the Americans entering the war on the side of the Allies. But as events played out in the Pacific, that was precisely what would happen before 1941 drew to a close. Just as Hitler had built his power base in Europe during the 1930s, the Japanese had been expanding their empire, most notably occupying territory in China, instigating the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which resulted in Japan resigning from the League of Nations. Roosevelt registered American disapproval by terminating trading with Japan, but the Empire of the Sun continued to expand until in 1941 the USA put a complete embargo on oil supplies to the Japanese. This was a major problem, as America provided 80% of Japan's oil, and if going to war with the USA was the only way to secure this most precious of raw materials, the Japanese were prepared to do it. However, being excellent military strategists, they knew they would have to plan with the greatest of care, and the element of surprise would be absolutely crucial. In fact, Japan's Admiral Yamamoto instigated the first request for naval intelligence on the American fleet based in Hawaii in 1940, and as relations with Washington deteriorated, the plan to bomb the US Navy at Pearl Harbor on Sunday the 7th of December 1941 really began to take shape. For Japan, the mission was a total success as the Americans awoke to total devastation, with the first wave of Japanese pilots attacking at 7:45 a.m, while 3/4 of the anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. In less than 30 minutes, the US Navy had been decimated with the loss of 16 ships, more than 160 planes, and 2,400 servicemen. When news reached President Roosevelt in the White House, he described it as a day of infamy. And not surprisingly, on the 8th of December, America declared war on Japan with the full support of the nation. There couldn't have been a more defining moment, not least because of the tripartite pact, which meant that Germany and Italy were duty-bound to declare war on the USA, which they did on the 11th of December. As ever, Winston Churchill had something to say on the subject of America entering the war, remarking that Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. Not that Churchill escaped the attention of the Japanese, because they had also declared war on Great Britain. Never slow to act, the nation's Prime Minister reciprocated on the 8th of December. The world was quite literally now at war, and as the true horror of Adolf Hitler's treatment of those banished to Nazi concentration camps was now becoming all too evident, the determination of the Allies to overthrow the Axis powers was a powerful force to be reckoned with. At the beginning of 1941, Winston Churchill and the British had stood alone in their battle to withstand the Nazi threat, and Hitler was still very much in the ascendancy. However, by the end of a year of defining moments, the world's greatest financial power, the Americans, the world's greatest military power, the Russians, and the world's greatest empire, the British, were all joined together fighting for the Allied cause, turning the tide very definitely in their favour for the first time since the outbreak of World War II. The arrival of the Americans on the field of battle made a huge impact, quite literally, on a global scale, as 1942 progressed. This wasn't always considered positive, however, and when the GIs flooded into the UK with their stylish uniforms and Hollywood accents, the British men described them as overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Perhaps not surprisingly, the GIs were extremely popular with the ladies of Britain, bringing with them such rationed treasures as cigarettes, chocolate, and nylon stockings, which no doubt went a long way to fueling such jealous comments. Nevertheless, the Americans had their own witty retort, describing their British counterparts as underpaid, undersexed, and under-Monty. The Monty in question was in fact the British general Bernard Montgomery, and the Americans came into contact with this maverick Englishman when they were sent to provide assistance to the Allies in North Africa. Montgomery became famous for choreographing such defining moments as the Allied victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein, turning the war in the desert dramatically. Hitler's desert fox, Erwin Rommel, had been unable to defeat Montgomery's 8th Army, and this battle certainly marked the end of any further Axis expansion in North Africa. Yet despite Montgomery's huge popularity with the men who fought under his command, he posed quite a problem for the American generals sent to take charge of desert missions. In fact, the US general, Walter Bedell Smith, actually told Monty straight that he was great to serve under, difficult to serve alongside, and hell to serve over. But Montgomery, true to form, continued to follow his own path, and there would be many defining moments, courtesy of Monty, still to come. Yet the frustrations of dealing with such colourful characters as Montgomery were minor compared to the onslaught Japan was orchestrating in the Pacific, and it wasn't only the Americans who faced the imperial strength of the Japanese army. With attacks on the American territories of Guam and the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies and British-held Malaya, Japan was advancing at an alarming rate, fueled by the attraction of raw materials such as oil and rubber. For the British, with outposts of the Empire now under threat, the need for battleships in the area was of vital importance. But when HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were torpedoed by the Japanese just days after Pearl Harbor, it effectively meant the end of Allied shipping in the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And the Japanese were very keen to take full advantage of the situation, as a succession of defining moments quickly followed. On Christmas Day 1941, the British dependency of Hong Kong fell to the Japanese, and a month later the British troops withdrew from Singapore, which also surrendered to the Japanese on the 15th of February 1942. Thousands of soldiers from Great Britain, along with Indian and Australian personnel, were taken as POWs and suffered barbaric treatment at the hands of the Japanese, as did many captured civilians, including women and children. As news reached the rest of the world of the atrocities being committed, determination grew amongst the Allied nations to halt the Japanese in their tracks. And when 76,000 Americans were taken prisoner when the Philippines surrendered, President Roosevelt was swift to take action. The men were forced to walk more than 100 kilometers in the hot sun in what has gone down in history as the Bataan Death March, with many dying as a result, incensing the people back home in America. In retaliation, the US launched a blistering attack on the Japanese capital, Tokyo, sending shockwaves through the city. And on this occasion, it was the Americans who had the element of surprise on their side. As a defining moment, the bombing of Tokyo by the Americans was major, but shortly after this, one of the most significant naval battles of all time was set to take place between Japan and the USA, and it was considered to be a crucial turning point in the war for the Allies. At the end of May 1942, the Japanese fleet set sail for the island of Midway Atoll, believing that they had kept their plans top secret. But the Allies had cracked the codes used by the Japanese and were ready and waiting, with the first air battle they engaged in destroying a quarter of Japan's air force. It was a disaster for the Empire of the Sun. They had lost aircraft, carriers, and more than 3,500 men, and they would never again be able to fight a naval battle from a position of strength. Although the Emperor of Japan proclaimed the Battle of Midway a victory, it was a huge defeat. And for the Americans, it was a huge morale boost in the Pacific, giving them the edge over the Japanese for the first time since Pearl Harbor. Slowly things were improving little by little for the Allies, and in the European theatre of war, the Russian Red Army were beginning to make life very difficult for the German invaders. Adolf Hitler had his sights set on the Russian city of Stalingrad, and this was predominantly for propaganda value, as it bore the name of the Soviet dictator. Equally, Stalin was determined to defend the city to the bitter end, and as Hitler boasted that this was a conquest his Sixth Army would quickly achieve, another defining moment was about to go down in history. The conditions at Stalingrad were truly appalling for both fighting forces, and it proved to be the bloodiest battle in human history, with civilians caught in the crossfire treated with the worst kind of brutality. The combined casualties have been estimated at more than 1.5 million, with neither side able to give way, as Hitler and Stalin took on a siege mentality, refusing to even contemplate defeat. The new year of 1943 brought with it little cheer for Adolf Hitler from the east, and by the end of January, the Germans began their surrender. When the Red Army celebrated winning the Battle of Stalingrad on the 2nd of February, they had completely destroyed the German Sixth Army. It was a defining moment for Adolf Hitler, but not of the kind he'd been used to. And as his health deteriorated, possibly due to the onset of Parkinson's disease, his behaviour became even more unpredictable. However, there was one area where the Germans were seemingly unbeatable, namely at sea. Out in the Atlantic, the German U-boat offensive was devastating for the Allies. Even Winston Churchill later commented that the only thing that had really frightened him during the war was the U-boats. But in the end, the Allies won the battle for the Atlantic in a matter of months, and rather than there being one defining moment, many converged all at the same time. The brilliant code breakers at Bletchley Park, in the heart of the English countryside, consistently deciphered the Germans' Enigma transmissions, and combined with a new radar system that could detect submarines, which was small enough to be carried by patrol aircraft, the Allies were able to seize the advantage, and the war reached another turning point as Hitler's dominance at sea was steadily neutralised. Meanwhile, back on land, with the battle for North Africa completed, Allied troops, now strongly reinforced with American service personnel, were ready to cross the Mediterranean and begin their assault on Italy, starting with the island of Sicily. Although Operation Husky, as it was codenamed, was a success, the Germans and the Italians put up strong resistance. However, for the people of Italy, fighting Adolf Hitler's battles was something they no longer had any heart for, and an armistice was signed with the Allies on the 8th of September 1943. Mussolini was imprisoned on the orders of Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III, but the Germans rescued Mussolini from prison, and he was restored as a puppet ruler with the Nazis in total control of Italy. Europe was now a maelstrom of changing power bases. Despite matters progressing more slowly than had been anticipated in Italy, the Allies' plans for perhaps the biggest defining moment of the entire conflict were ready to be put into action. On the 6th of June 1944, a day later than had been anticipated because of the truly appalling weather conditions in the English Channel, an invasion force left the south coast of Britain heading for the beaches of Normandy. It would go down in history as D-Day, and despite Adolf Hitler being well aware that such an attack was imminent, it still came as a complete surprise, giving the Allies a huge advantage. The Germans had been convinced the invasion would come from Dover and target the Pas de Calais, and the Allies did all they could to encourage their enemy to believe this. For every reconnaissance flight over Normandy, there were 2 over Calais. This, combined with the dreadful weather, even convinced Rommel, the commander Hitler had appointed to defend France against invasion, that it was safe to return home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The 5 landing beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword, were located between Cherbourg and Caen, and the resistance met by the Allies varied dramatically. At Utah, the first of the American landing beaches, there were few Germans in defensive positions, and there were, accordingly, minimal casualties. But on neighbouring Omaha, the US soldiers were met by an elite German division and the carnage resulted in huge losses for the unsuspecting Allied servicemen. Casualties were also high on Sword Beach, where British troops came ashore. Nevertheless, by the end of D-Day, it was evident that the mission which had been so crucial to the Allies winning the war had heralded the beginning of the end. Incredibly, the events of D-Day could equally have gone Hitler's way, and it would in fact take the entire summer for the Battle of Normandy to be won. It was a costly campaign, with the Allies suffering casualties in excess of 210,000, almost 40,000 of which were fatalities. The German casualties were more than 300,000, and a visit to Normandy today, where memorials to the fallen on all sides of the conflict can be found, will prove to be an incredibly moving experience. There is no more poignant reminder of this particular defining moment than the cemeteries where the dead have been laid to rest, forever warning future generations of the true horrors of war. An event of the magnitude of D-Day certainly sent ripples in motion that would have far-reaching consequences, often in the most unexpected quarters. Although everyone's heard of the French resistance, many of us are not even aware that there was in fact a German resistance. But shortly after D-Day, an assassination attempt on the life of Adolf Hitler proved that such a movement not only existed, but was also well enough established to very nearly succeed in ending the Führer's reign of terror. There had been attempts made on Hitler's life by his own people right from his early rise to power, but the problem had always been getting close enough to him for it to be successful. However, when Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, previously a model German soldier who'd been awarded the Iron Cross, became horrified by Hitler's treatment of the Russians, most notably the Jews, while serving on the Eastern Front, things changed dramatically. When von Stauffenberg was made Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Home Army in June 1944, part of his role involved liaising directly with Hitler, and he certainly intended to make the most of the opportunity. The plan, Operation Valkyrie, was put into action on the 20th of July 1944, after the D-Day landings had been such a success for the Allies. Von Stauffenberg carried a bomb concealed in a briefcase into a meeting with Hitler at his Wolfschanze base in northern Poland. Fortunately, although the bomb went off after von Stauffenberg had left for Berlin to meet with his co-conspirators, the briefcase had been moved, and Hitler survived, suffering only temporary paralysis of the right arm and pierced eardrums. What might have been a major defining moment that would undoubtedly have shortened the war by many months had failed to happen, and despite the outcome of the conflict now being almost certain to go the Allies' way, many lives would still be lost that could have been saved if Operation Valkyrie had resulted in the death of Adolf Hitler. it was also evident that the Allies themselves viewed victory as a foregone conclusion, and as the Germans retreated back to their homeland towards the end of 1944, Allied command decided to hold their positions in France and make one final push for Berlin in the spring. But like a wounded animal, the Nazi war machine was still capable of inflicting immense damage, and in a last desperate bid to fight back, Hitler attempted a daring mission to split the Allies by again attacking through the Ardennes, just as he'd done on the way to Dunkirk all those years earlier. Beginning on the 16th of December, what has gone down in history as the Battle of the Bulge saw the American forces in the district thrown into turmoil. Nevertheless, the Germans were unable to capitalise on their advantage, and by early January 1945, Hitler withdrew his forces from the Ardennes, and the Battle of the Bulge was recorded as a decisive Allied victory. Hitler's last gamble had failed, but the Allies had still lost 81,000 men and more than 730 tanks, and as the push for Berlin now became the main focus in the European theatre of war, the Germans' final defining moment proved to be no more than a last sting in the tail. While the Allied leaders met at the Yalta Conference to decide the fate of post-war Germany, the fight for Berlin began in earnest. The Russians moved steadily from the east, while the Western Allies crossed the Rhine, and by April the Soviet troops, some 3 million strong, had dealt brutally with the last traces of German resistance. With the Russians at the gates of Berlin, Adolf Hitler had nowhere to run, and on the 30th of April he committed suicide as the city at the heart of his 1,000-year Reich burnt and crumbled in ruins around him. Effectively, the war in Europe was over, and after the official surrender on the 7th of May, VE Day was celebrated in style. As defining a moment as the death of Adolf Hitler was, the passing of another of World War II's main protagonists earlier in April was equally significant. Franklin D. Roosevelt had made a huge contribution to bringing peace to Europe, and he never did get to see the results of his endeavours. His successor, Harry S. Truman, was left with a huge dilemma, because the Japanese, still engaged in a bitter battle with US troops on the island of Okinawa, were showing no sign of even considering surrendering. In desperation, they were by this stage using kamikaze pilots, sacrificing young Japanese men to continue a war they couldn't win. And Truman realised that drastic measures were going to be required if further huge losses of American servicemen were to be prevented. Truman was also far more wary of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin than Roosevelt had been, and the Russian was now controlling much of Eastern Europe. With the battle for Berlin won, Stalin turned his attention to the Japanese, preparing to send reinforcements, but the Western Allies were concerned that if the Soviets became too powerful in Japan, the situation was unlikely to bode well for world peace. The American president was presented with a possible solution, when the testing of a new weapon proved successful in the Mexican desert on the 16th of July. Truman now had an atomic bomb at his disposal, and on the 6th of August, a US B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped the first atom bomb on the Japanese town of Hiroshima. When there was still no surrender forthcoming, a second nuclear bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and with the appalling consequences of this new generation of weapons now evident, the Japanese formally surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945. The Second World War was finally over, but peace came at a terrible price. Recovery for the victors and the vanquished was going to take years, as nations started to rebuild themselves. But the scars of the conflict would, without doubt, shape not only the immediate future of the post-war world, but also have far-reaching consequences into the next millennium. More than 70 million people had died, men, women and children, civilians and military personnel alike. The number left homeless was staggering as refugees struggled to re-establish their lives wherever they could. And as the real truth about the horrific war crimes that had been perpetrated on the orders of Adolf Hitler came to light, it was all too obvious that a spirit of peace and reconciliation was never going to be easy to achieve. Nevertheless, the Allies were determined that even such notorious war criminals as Hermann Göring should receive appropriate justice, and the Nuremberg trials were held in Germany between 1945 and 1949 to ensure that those responsible for atrocities were held to account for their actions. It was also important that the Allies did all in their power to promote better relations between every nation, so that the rise of a dictator as dominant as Adolf Hitler, committing such terrible crimes against humanity, could be prevented from ever happening again. Just as the League of Nations had been formed for this laudable purpose after the First World War, the United Nations came into being on the 24th of October 1945 to continue the peacekeeping role. But the aftermath of this second global conflict was far more complex, not least because of the availability of nuclear weapons. The alliance between Russia, America and Britain had always been uneasy, and East-West relations started to deteriorate long before the end of the war. And it was soon evident that the USA and the USSR were now the major powers in the brave new world post-1945. The British Empire was in effect finished, and with the nations previously occupied by colonial powers gaining their independence, the maps were all having to be redrawn. But as India, once described as the jewel in the empire's crown, escaped British rule, it faced further turmoil, resulting in the independence of the Muslim nation of Pakistan. Meanwhile, in Britain, Winston Churchill lost the general election of 1945, shortly after peace was declared, as the people he had led through such terrible times turned to Clement Attlee and the Labour Party to rebuild a more socially aware Britain, complete with a cradle-to-the-grave national health service. There was also the big question of how to manage Germany in the devastation left by Hitler and Nazi party politics, and it was partitioned off into 4 zones, coordinated by the Allied Control Council. However, as a Cold War developed between the USA and the Soviet Union, the American, French and British zones joined together to form the Federal Republic of Germany, while the Russian zone became the German Democratic Republic. As matters deteriorated yet further between the USA and Russia after their head-to-head involvement supporting opposing factions in the Korean War, which began in 1950, and the Vietnam War fought into the 1960s, a closed border was created by the Russian-backed communists, separating East and West Germany. This was never more graphically demonstrated than in the city of Berlin, where in 1961 a great wall was constructed, preventing the people from the communist East having any contact with their neighbours in the West. In the post-war years, the Russians continued to strengthen their position with the Warsaw Pact. The Americans did the same with NATO. But as a result, during the 1950s and 60s, there were some extremely dangerous clashes, and the threat of a nuclear war between the two emerging superpowers became a threat of total destruction for the whole world. Perhaps memories of the horrific aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sufficient a deterrent for common sense to prevail, and as the years went by, globally the superpowers at least settled to an uneasy stalemate. It could be said that the final defining moment of World War II didn't occur until the Berlin Wall was torn down in 1989, as the communist regime fueled by the legacy of Joseph Stalin collapsed. Ironically, in the city where Adolf Hitler had made his bid for world supremacy, a spirit of reconciliation has triumphed over the evils of tyranny, because in 1990 East and West Germany were reunified. If you come to Berlin today, you'll find a truly beautiful city that has come to terms with its traumatic past. From the once burnt-out Reichstag to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, this city marks the restoration of not only peace, but also compassionate humanity as World War II's most hopeful defining moment of all.